Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Leadership Twilight Zone, Handling Situations That Aren't on the Manual. And these situations aren't in the manual. Okay. This training is brought to you by Commercial Electronics. If you'd like to learn more about our recording solution, third-party quality assurance services, or Live 911, visit comelectronics.com. This webinar is part of our public safety education series, and you can view our upcoming webinars on our training page at comelectronics.com/training. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you're listening in using your computer speaker system, you're automatically muted to eliminate background noise. If you'd prefer to join over the phone, just select the handset in the audio pane at the bottom right, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit questions about today's lesson at any time by typing your questions into the Q&A pane of the control panel, and I'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. And then for those of you wanting to report this training to your state certification or licensing agency, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. And let me apologize now in advance for any barking, any whining, or anything else that you happen to hear in the background here. I've told my husband to be quiet, but I can't guarantee that he will. Okay. My name is Beth English, and I'm your instructor today. I began my 911 career as a police dispatcher 33 years ago, and most recently served as communications director before joining Commercial Electronics as the program manager for their QA program and higher ground instructor. I have my master's telecommunicator license from Texas. I'm a TCOL instructor and a past Texas MENA president. So let's get started with our session. We hope it's going to be fun today. So today's objectives, we are going to identify situations that should be covered by policies. We're going to list some policy statements that can apply to more than one situation. We're going to discuss the evolving workplace, and we're going to write specific wording to cover extraordinary situations. Now, have you ever gone to work and felt like you were in the twilight zone? Issues come up with employees, and you're actually frightened by the things that they do. You hear those 4 notes over and over again in your head. You're normal-ish, so you wonder why others can't be normal too. But employees have a way of coming up with some of the strangest situations. And if you've been a leader for any amount of time, you've probably come across at least one situation that you just didn't know how to handle. Nothing like it has been addressed in any leadership course you took, and there's no specific policy to tie to it. So what do? How do you handle these strange situations and still follow policy and maintain peace in your center? Well, today we're going to review some situations that were strange and some that were just downright maddening, and we're going to learn how to tie them into your policies. You may find that you need to create some new policies that you don't have, and you may find that some situations, no matter how bizarre, just don't call for any action. Now, all of these situations we're about to discuss were real situations that were committed by real employees at real agencies. So hang on to your hats. It's fixing to get interesting. Okay, we're going to start with a very easy one. One employee at an agency who had 2 children from a previous marriage let it be known to her coworkers that she and her partner wanted to have another child. Another employee who she was friends with said he would be her donor. Now, each year this agency had a dinner or some other type of celebration for their employees for TC Week. Now, this particular year, in order to accommodate the night shift, the agency had a breakfast banquet at a nice dining location close to the communication center so that people could come and go. And during that year's banquet, the employee who had stated that he would be the donor for the other employee arrived with his donation in a paper bag, which he promptly set on the table in front of her and announced to everyone what it was. So, let's take a poll. How would you have handled the generous donor situation? Would you have fired the donor, written up the donor, put the donor on unpaid leave, or done nothing? Okay, so you should be able to see the results there. About 35% said they would have written up the donor. Some of you would have put the donor on unpaid leave, and most of you would have done nothing. Okay. Well, we're all going to face behaviors at work that we consider weird. In fact, if you really think about it, you probably think most people are weird because they're not like you. I know I do. But the thing about employees being weird is that you need to focus on the effect that their weirdness has on their job performance and the rest of the agency. Is their weird behavior causing problems with their work or with other employees? Is it affecting your agency negatively? Is it disruptive to their shift? In the case of the very generous donor, the incident happened off-duty, away from the agency, and it didn't affect anyone's work. So as weird and disgusting as it was, there was actually nothing to be done about the situation. He didn't break any policies, and no one complained about his donation. But let's look at one that had an effect on others. One agency had an employee who thrived on drama. Now, this probably sounds completely foreign to you since there are so very few drama queens in communications. So you might have to stretch your imagination a bit. But this drama queen was constantly causing problems, not overtly, but more passive-aggressively. So we're going to refer to her as Ms. DQ. One year, she decided, for whatever reason, that she needed to keep track of what the supervisors were doing every minute of every day. She had a 3-ring binder that only had 2 sections in it, one for each supervisor. If one of the supervisors left the room to go to the restroom, Ms. DQ would open her binder to that supervisor's section and she would make note of the time. And she would make enough of a production of it that there was no doubt to what she was doing. And then when the supervisor came back in the room, Ms. DQ would open her binder again and note the time. And this occurred during every break, every lunch break, restroom break, personal telephone call, you name it. Now, obviously, this affected the work of not just the supervisors, but also others on the shift, partly because it demonstrated to her coworkers a complete lack of respect toward the supervisors, and partly because her coworkers didn't know if they were going to be the next binder victims. So, how should we handle this situation? So let's find out. Tell me, do you have a policy that would address this behavior? Something in policy right now. Okay, we were at 50-50. Still not too far off from that. So, some of us have policies and some of us don't that would specifically address that behavior. Okay? All right. So, to determine that, let's look at how the workplace has evolved. You know, back in the day, and this is before my day, but back in the day, people just went to work, they did their jobs, and they went home. No one was expected to think outside the box. Workers were expected to think alike, dress alike, stay at the same company for years, and then retire with a gold watch. Loyalty is what was valued above all else. And teamwork was not a word because everyone agreed whether they agreed or not. And managing a team was easy because everyone thought the same way. Then came the age of sex, drugs, and rock and roll when baby boomers entered the workforce. That was a time of forced tolerance for new things, new ideas, diversity, and since it was forced, workers still tried to blend in because the same people still held all the power. So even though the doors had opened to women and different races in the workforce, they were still excluded from the executive offices. Now, eventually, the economy changed. Technology came in, and many of those in charge started retiring with their gold watches. The ones who were left had to make some hard decisions as to who would remain, and it became pretty much every man for himself. The Stepford employees were no more, and as supervisors, we had to start dealing with issues that hadn't come up before. Well, now employees are individuals with their own strengths and weaknesses, and they have no hesitation in expressing those strengths and weaknesses through abnormal behavior. So the issue now is how to handle those abnormal behaviors. Well, every agency probably has general orders and/or policy manuals to address job descriptions, holidays, vacations, drug use, theft, etc. Any additional policies beyond those generally have names attached to them. The problem with policy manuals is that they generally get created and then left alone to collect dust on the shelves. And then when something happens, we suddenly realize there are no policies to cover the situation because none has ever been written about it. Who had the time to do it? You know, many moons ago, when an officer went on a call or a traffic stop, he might run the LP or the DL, and if he was really ambitious, he might run a criminal history. And then technology advanced, and as it did, it made it, quote unquote, easier to do our jobs. Unfortunately, as it got easier, we were able to do more, and so now it's expected that we do more. So now we're able to check Interpol, Canada, Mexico. We can see if a vehicle's been involved in any previous calls. We can check to see if there were any previous calls at the location. And then you add to that the training that we have to do to keep up our certification, and the fact that we have to use vacation and holiday time before the end of the year or lose it. So it's not that we don't think policies are important, we just no longer have downtime to keep them updated. But keeping them updated is not enough. We've got to word them so that they can cover instances that aren't normally specifically mentioned in the policies. In the example of the employee keeping track of supervisor's time, it's not just enough to have a harassment policy that addresses sexual harassment or bullying. It's got to cover any harassment. Now, a good example of a harassment policy would be this one from Boone County, Missouri, Joint Communications. And so if anybody from Boone County, Missouri is on here, I give you my kudos for this. This is where they've written about other unacceptable conduct. And their policy says conduct which has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. Okay? Good point there. They've got several different points listed, but look at the last one where it says attempting to impugn or tarnish an employee's reputation. Now, with the term in the very first part of it, intimidating, the actions of Ms. DQ were covered, as well as that last one, attempting to impugn or tarnish an employee's reputation. Because what else would someone who is documenting a senior employee's time going to do with that information other than impugn or tarnish that supervisor's reputation? Another section could be added onto this about insubordination, and insubordination that goes beyond chain of command and disobedience, because generally we're going to have an insubordination in our general orders, sometimes in our policies. We'll have a policy about insubordination, but it talks about chain of command and disobedience. But we could also add a section that includes rude and disrespectful behaviors, such as insolence. So if this incident wasn't enough to convince you of the need to have a good harassment policy, let's consider these next two incidents. An agency used seniority to determine all employee placement. That included days off, shifts, etc. Now, one day, a midnight shift senior employee who was facing significant health issues was ordered by her doctor to get more rest. She requested a transfer to another shift to comply with this doctor's orders, and that request was approved. Now, the junior employee who was being moved to accommodate the request got angry, yelling at the sergeant in charge, and said she might as well put a .38 to her head and pull the trigger. Now, even though this wasn't a threat towards the sergeant, it did create a situation in which the employee's behavior was called into question, with the possibility of it escalating into violence. Now, the second situation, this one occurred at an agency that I worked for, and it involved an employee who had a crush on an officer who shared the same first name as another dispatcher. We'll call them Dispatcher John and Officer John. So one day I went in on a Saturday to teach the Citizens Police Academy. And while I was there, I went into communications to visit with the dispatchers on duty before I started teaching the police academy. And dispatcher John and I were kidding around like we always did. We were tossing insults back and forth. And I said something to him about having to see John first thing in the morning on my day off. Now, the dispatcher who had the crush on Officer John was on the phone. She was taking a call. She heard part of the conversation, and she assumed that I was talking about Officer John and that I was insulting him. So she sent him a message telling him that I was talking about him and saying ugly things about him. Now, when the CPA class was over, I went back into communications, and I was informed by one of the other dispatchers in there about the message that had been sent to Officer John. So when I walked out of communications, I found him, and I told him that there had been a misunderstanding and that the conversation was not about him and that I would never say anything ugly about him. And then I went back in my office to make a phone call. So shortly after that, the dispatcher came into my office and started yelling at me, called me a liar, saying that she knew what I said and that I was talking about Officer John. She told me I had no right to be talking like that about anyone, especially Officer John. Now, this whole time, I'm sitting in my office chair. She's leaning over my desk, pointing her finger in my face. And this employee was ex-military, and she was a big girl. So I, being the leader and the brave soul that I am, stood up and pointed my finger and said, you need to get out of my office right now. She walked out. She did walk out. But then she turned around and she told me that I had better not ever disrespect anyone I work with again, or anyone that she worked with again, whether that's John dispatcher or John officer. And then she told me that if I ever disrespected anyone that she worked with again, I would be sorry. So with these last three incidents, you can see where a very well-worded harassment policy would be needed. The thing is you can't cover every incident with a policy that just says you can't harass anyone. You've got to make it as broad as possible to cover any kind of harassment, threats, violence, and any other weird harassment issue that might come up. So if you're wondering how to cover the issues you can't think of, read the news every day. There are stories abounding about things that people have done when they were angry. Realize also that there are going to be incidents where you won't need policy to cover the incident because the law is going to take care of it. Take, for instance, the issue of the training coordinator who was going to be made communications administrator on a Monday until he killed his wife, a police officer, with her own service weapon on Friday. In instances like this, there are no policies to cover the situation, just the law. And yes, that really did happen. Now, here's another one. There was an employee who started exhibiting medical issues not too long after being hired. She would zone out while working a station and one time almost passed out. She was transported several times before she finally informed her supervisors that she had been diagnosed as having a seizure disorder. She stated that she had been given medication to prevent the seizures, and she submitted a doctor's note that indicated she was able to return to work full-time with no restrictions. Now, one day, her lips turned blue as she zoned out while she was answering the phones. Her coworker noticed her blue lips, and we called EMS. It turned out that she had been drinking blue Kool-Aid, and that's why her lips were blue. But she was transported because she had had another seizure where she zoned out. She returned to work again with a doctor's note stating that she could work without restrictions. Then a couple of weeks later, she said she was feeling weak and she couldn't breathe, and again, her lips were blue. So EMS was notified. And as the medics were readying her for transport, one of the medics' sleeves brushed against her lips, and the blue came off onto his sleeve. It turned out that it was blue eyeshadow. So, tell me what you think. Which policy here do you think would cover this issue? Okay, so most of you say fitness for duty. Nobody says peaceful work environment. That's good. Personnel conduct, performance of duty, and fitness for duty. Okay. Now, factitious disorder is a serious mental disorder in which someone deceives others by appearing sick. Now, the symptoms can range from mild, with a slight exaggeration of symptoms, to severe, which was previously called Munchausen syndrome. And those with factitious disorder will go to great lengths to hide their deception, such as drinking blue Kool-Aid to produce blue lips. So it's difficult to tell that their symptoms are actually part of a mental disorder. And just as with this employee, they will continue with the deception even without receiving any benefit or if they're faced with evidence that doesn't support their claims. So some of the signs and symptoms of factitious disorder include extensive knowledge of medical terms and diseases. Now, in this case, she had gone to EMT school, and so she did have knowledge of medical terms and diseases. Vague or consistent symptoms, which there were, conditions that get worse for no apparent reason, frequent stays in the hospital. Again, that was another one. Seeking treatment from several different doctors or hospitals, which may include using a fake name, and reluctance to allow doctors to talk to family or friends or to other healthcare professionals. Now, all of these symptoms were displayed by this employee, and it was later determined that she had been seeing different doctors using variations of her name. Now, when she was confronted with the issue of her faking illness, she denied it, but it didn't happen again while she was with this particular agency. In the end, she was terminated for her inability to do the job. So, how would your center handle something like this? What policies do you have in place to prevent this from continuing? Well, as with any health-related issue, you have to tread lightly. And handling something like this the wrong way can land your agency in a world of trouble. Working with your HR department is an absolute must, along with having good policies to address fitness for duty. In this case, the employer could have required the employee to have a medical exam by a doctor provided by the city. But there would be some hoops that they would have to jump through under the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA. They couldn't require the employee to submit release forms that ask for irrelevant information. For instance, anything that violates the ADA or GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And then any information sought had to be job-related or consistent with business necessity. Now, in your policy manual, you should have a policy that addresses the job duties that are mandatory, and if those duties can't be performed by the employee, they have the option to apply for other positions within the organization, or they will be terminated. This is an example of one policy from the Washington County Consolidated Communications Agency in Oregon. Anybody from this agency? Kudos to y'all. So this is their fit for duty, and it says personnel who report for duty or are on duty while knowingly impaired may face disciplinary action up to and including termination. And then it refers to the substance abuse policy. But it also has a section for observation and reporting. And it talks about any individual observed to be mentally or physically impaired and or who may be unable to effectively and safely perform one or more essential functions of their job may be subject to a fit for duty evaluation by a contracted physician or other qualified designee. So it also goes on to say that signs of inability to perform may include, but is not limited to, lack of manual dexterity, coordination, alertness, speech, vision, acuity, concentration, weakness, illness, disorientation, memory loss, and erratic behavior. Now, something else to pay close attention to when you're dealing with illnesses, FMLA, and return to work notices or fit for duty notices, is you want to pay attention to the date on the notice. One agency had an employee who was on FMLA and had a return to work notice with a specific date on it. Now, when the time to return to work got close, the employee was still not feeling well, but rather than tell the doctor she wasn't feeling well and needed more time, she changed the date on the notice, and that cost her job. So pay attention to the notices to make sure that your employees are really ready to return or that they're not extending their return to work time. Now, having a policy that specifies the mandatory job duties is not just to cover illnesses and disabilities. It can also cover specific functions such as data entry and bilingual employees. It should also include consequences to responders and the public should the employee be unable to perform these mandatory duties. And so what I mean by that is that if they can't perform these duties, how is that going to affect responders and the public? Okay? And then testing should also be done to determine if those duties can be performed before an employee is hired, which most of us do. We test for, typing, we test for data entry, a lot of us use the critical test, some of us do some psychological tests, and a lot of agencies do test for bilingual, but not all agencies do. If somebody says they're bilingual because they're Hispanic, well, then, a lot of agencies allow them in and say, okay, well, they're bilingual. One agency, however, had a chief who believed that although he couldn't type 40 words a minute, he could sit down at the console and do the job of a dispatcher. So he removed the typing requirement from the job description. Now, this is at an agency that had CAD, telephony, they did EMD, and every other function that could be done on the computer. Now, during this chief's reign of terror, the agency had an applicant who was bilingual, quote unquote, but could only type 9 words per minute. The chief wanted her hired because she was, quote unquote, bilingual, and it would look good in his numbers to have a Hispanic dispatcher. Now, she had nothing in her background to prevent her from being hired, so she became the first trainee after his edict. Well, it turned out that while she was bilingual, she actually had difficulty entering the words that people were saying into the call sheet, because what she would do is she would listen to the English-speaking callers, and then she would translate what they were saying as they said it into Spanish in her mind. And then she would have to translate it back to English to type it into the call sheet at 9 words per minute. Now, the supervisor advised the director of the department that the trainee couldn't type and was a danger to citizens while taking calls, especially med calls. And, basically what she was told is that the trainee could be taught the skills. So what they did is they purchased a typing program, and the trainee sat in an office 8 hours a day with this typing program, learning to type. Eventually, that chief was replaced, and the typing requirement was reinstated in the job description and the job requirements. Now, in the meantime, the communications policy was also updated to include minimum and maximum training times, which gave the agency more leverage when terminating this trainee, because the training times before, there were no minimum or maximum, and so this trainee could literally have been in training for 3 years learning to type. So adding the minimum and maximum training times to the policy actually helped immensely in this situation. Another issue that can come up that needs a good policy is suspected drug use. Now, every organization has policies against drug use, and generally they're going to have a policy for random testing of essential positions for drug use. But a lot of organizations don't consider communications essential. As much as we're working towards that, and as hard as we're trying to get agencies to recognize us as essential, It's not everywhere yet. And we're not considered essential because we're not on the street. We don't have personal contact with the public. So because of that, if drug use is suspected in a telecommunicator, it can be difficult proving it because a lot of us aren't allowed to test our employees for drugs because we're not considered essential. So this was the case with one dispatcher. Her husband had left her, and her doctor put her on antidepressants. Then shortly afterward, she had a wreck on the way to work, and she broke her back. And they put her on pain relievers. So you can see where this is going. One Saturday, the assistant city manager was doing a tour of a fire station for the city's leadership group when a med call was dispatched by this dispatcher. And the assistant city manager called communications immediately afterward and ordered the supervisor to remove the dispatcher from the fire radio because she was slurring her words and they didn't understand at all what the call was that had just been dispatched. Now, when the supervisor removed the employee from the radio, the employee got belligerent and started arguing with the dispatcher. Over the past few months, many attempts to have this employee drug tested had been refused because of the city policy in place and the fact that dispatchers were not considered essential employees. Shortly after this incident, the policy was changed to allow drug testing of any employee suspected of drug use. And what ended up happening was this particular long-time employee was eventually transferred to another department. So, question here, is your department allowed to do random drug testing of communications employees? Okay, so almost all of us are now, okay? We still got some that can't, but, and this is where your policies need to come in. Okay. When you think about putting your responders in danger, your policies need to include a section about an employee putting the responders in danger. If you don't have this in your policies, you might want to think about that and think about putting that in there. And this could be whether it's drugs or any other action that's going to put your responders in danger. So one employee who had been a model employee for years started a slow decline in job performance and personal care. Now, where she had been a stickler for details before, she started missing small details at first, and then eventually she started missing big details. She also started letting her appearance go, most of the time coming to work in the clothes she had slept in and failing to comb her hair. Initially, when she started this decline, she would bring her makeup to work and apply it while sitting at her workstation, but eventually even that stopped. And then as it went, as time went by, prescription drugs became a problem. But again, the agency didn't have policies in place to address the situation. Now, one day this employee got into an argument with her supervisor in their cab messenger over calling in sick. The employee had called in sick the day before, but she wanted to use a vacation day instead of a sick day. And the supervisor said no because of the sick policy that was in place at the time. So the employee sent a message through the CAD messenger to the supervisor stating that she quit. But the supervisor had gotten up from her station and left the room. And when the supervisor didn't answer the message immediately, the employee stood up, took off her headset, and left the dispatch radio unmanned. She didn't tell anyone, and she didn't wait for relief on the radio. So by leaving the radio unmanned, she put all the officers' lives in danger. Having a section in your policy manual that addresses issues like this may not keep someone from committing this type of infraction, but it gives you recourse if it does. And this one here is one sample of a section to have in your policy to cover this type of issue. So in this case, performance of duty, and the policy's unsatisfactory performance may be demonstrated by, but is not limited to, failure to handle radio traffic properly and professionally. In that case, this would have covered the agency for her termination. So you'll probably want to include a section also detailing what will happen for failure to follow the policy, such as whether you're going to do a written warning or this infraction will result in immediate termination. Now, how do you handle it when your people are the subject of calls that you take on a regular basis? For instance, you get a call from another agency advising you that they have a hot check warrant for your employee who is currently working the radio and they're on their way to arrest them. Do you warn your employee who's currently working the radio, or do you handle it as business as usual, just like you would any other call? Do your employees know what to do if they receive that kind of call? What about a repo? A repo driver calls in and says he has just picked up a vehicle from the lot of the PD, and the vehicle belongs to a dispatcher on duty. Do you tell the employee that their vehicle just got repoed, or do you handle the call just like you would any other repo call? Again, do your employees know how to handle that? Having a policy in place for call taking would help avoid any confusion that would come up when that call comes in. I know that there's a certain amount of loyalty to our team members, but is it their place to give others a heads up? What do you think about that? Tell me what you think. Another agency calls your center to say they're going to arrest one of your employees. Do you give them a heads up? Okay. Most of y'all say no. Some of you say yes. Okay. Whatever you're going to do, it should be in policy. If you want your dispatchers to handle that call as any other call that's coming in, it needs to be in the policy. If you want them to be able to notify that employee, then it needs to be in the policy that they can do that. Okay. Now, we all know how difficult it is to get a day off when you're working shift work. Like I said earlier, many of us have to take our vacation and holidays off by the end of the year or we lose them. Not to mention, if someone else has already taken off the day that you want, your agency won't pay overtime for you to take off too. In fact, a lot of agencies won't pay overtime for anybody to be off, period. So what's the solution? We trade places. We get someone to change shifts with us so that we can take the day off that we need, and then we work for them on one of our days off. Now, since these are off the book, so to speak, admin doesn't get involved in the trades unless approval is needed for someone to work a specific position. For instance, you've got someone who was just released from training on the radio. Can they work for one of your radio operators that wants off? And this whole trading places is a great system until it isn't. And I'm sure that this has happened probably in almost every agency, which means we should have policies for this practice, but many of us don't. And if we do have a policy for this, it's got a specific person's name on it. So let's say, for instance, one employee, we'll call her employee A, always needed time off, either when others were already off or when she had already used up all of her time. So she would get someone to trade with her. And after several times of doing this, most employees quit trading shifts with her because she was never available to pay them back when they asked her. She always had plans on her days off that she couldn't cancel. Well, employee B, however, just couldn't say no to anyone. So every time employee A asked her to trade shifts, employee B would say yes. And as usual, employee A was never able to repay the time. And by the time employee A left the agency, she owed employee B at least 4 days. She eventually paid employee B for the time she worked for her. I mean, literally paid her, but the check bounced. So there was a life lesson learned. Now, if you don't already have a policy about trading places because your agency doesn't want to be involved, it might be time to think about being involved. It doesn't mean that your agency has to approve the trades, but a policy stating that there will be consequences if things get out of hand could be in order. So, here is our last poll. Does your agency have a policy regarding trading shifts? Oh, that's good. A lot of agencies do. A lot of agencies don't. Okay. Well, this is if you don't have one of these policies in place, it's definitely something to think about, because if there haven't been problems before, there will be at some point. Okay. Now, we all know how hard it is to hire people and the processes that we have to go through. Now, many agencies have added sit-alongs to their hiring process to see if the applicant feels that they can handle the job and also if they fit into the agency culture. So not only are they checking out your agency and current employees, but your employees are also checking out the applicant. And we all know what a pain this can be if your applicant happens to be very attractive. Now, I don't mean that to sound biased, but if you've been in a comm center for more than 10 minutes, you know what I mean. One particular applicant who did a sit-along was very attractive. After 4 hours of sitting in communications, she was best friends with the male employees on the shift. They traded phone numbers and they became friends on Facebook. And shortly after the applicant left, one of the male employees copied her profile picture from Facebook and texted out to several of the male officers. Needless to say, the day that the applicant started working with the agency, the manager had to have officers banned from the center because they were causing such a disruption. Now, unfortunately, there was no policy to address this behavior, but like I said, anything beyond the basic policies has a name on it, as does that new policy. Now, I mentioned a policy earlier from Boone County, Missouri, Joint Communications, and I believe that that policy could also cover this situation. Now, there's no way your policies are going to cover every issue that will come up, nor can you have a solution to every problem. Sometimes you just have to weigh the action against the worth of the employee and the employee's work value. In some cases, the employee's work is valuable enough to overlook their weirdness as long as it doesn't affect the rest of the employees. But in other cases, their work value will not be worth keeping the employee, and you need to know when to cut them loose. And this is where having the good policies are going to come into play. So not only is it important to have good policies in place, but they've got to be kept up to date, and all of your employees and supervisors need to be trained in them. If everyone is trained in your policies, then you don't have to worry about supervisors overreacting. But having no policy is not a reason not to act. So let's say, for instance, an employee shows up with a tattoo that you don't like, but it's never been discussed before. So your reaction should be to go through HR, come up with a plan to handle, any similar issues in the future. But if someone shows up with an obscene tattoo, that's a whole nother matter, and one that needs to be addressed immediately. So always be prepared to go to HR to handle issues that you don't have policies to cover. But before that, do everything you can to keep your policies updated, even if it means paying a third-party company to do it for you, because it's going to save your agency more than the cost of hiring a third-party company in the long run. Now, if you're not familiar with it, a great resource for policies is the APCO PS Connect library. The examples that I've shown you have all been taken from policies that have been shared on the website. And I will say that this fitness for duty policy, it's from WCCCA, is particularly good. And if you don't have access to the website, email me and I'll get you a copy of it. Because the policy even has a communicable disease restriction list, it has a medication disclosure statement, and a fitness for duty evaluation form attached. And one other thing to think about, even if you've never had situations like these present themselves at your agency, obviously they do happen. So you might consider adding some questions to your interview list. Questions such as, when was the last time you got angry with a supervisor? What did you do? When was the last time a supervisor got angry with you? What did you do? What would you do if someone shared your profile picture without your permission? Have you ever traded shifts with a coworker? How long did it take you to pay them back? And when was the last time someone harassed you at work? What actions did you take? Finding out if your applicants have been involved in similar incidents before you hire them can keep you from bringing that same baggage into your center. Now, before we get to the questions, I want to remind you to tune in next month, same bat time, same bat channel, on Wednesday, November 4th at noon Central Time for our next webinar in the series, Leading the Toxic Employee. We all have them, the toxic employee, the one who makes everyone else hate to come to work. And so how do you lead those people when all you want to do is terminate them? Believe it or not, there are ways to handle them to minimize the damage that they cause. And so in that session, we're going to discuss various ways of dealing with them while maintaining your sanity. So now, if you've got any questions, go ahead and send them to me in the Q&A pane, and I'll answer any questions that you've got. And I'll leave this up until anybody that has questions can send them in. And in the meantime, I will tell you that if you need information on today's lesson for continuing education credits, send an email to training@calmelectronics.com. And I want to thank you for joining us. This presentation has been made possible by Commercial Electronics, provider of public safety solutions, including Higher Ground NG 911 recording, Live 911, and CQIP third-party quality assurance program. So if you don't have any questions, have a great day. If you do, I will be here for a few more minutes to answer those questions. Okay, one question that came up in regards to bilingual testing must be done. Are you talking about in regards to typing? I'm sorry, I said it. I was cutting off while telling you. I was not talking about typing. I was actually talking about a test to determine if the person actually is bilingual. There are several HR tests that can be given to determine if a person is actually bilingual or not. And so you might check with your HR department if you have one. Otherwise, you can look online and Google bilingual tests that you might be able to use to find out if an applicant actually is bilingual. You will get a copy of the slides and a recording, which will include the slides. If you want the slides separate from the recording, if you just want a copy of the slide deck, send me an email. You can send it to Beth@calmelectronics.com.